Welcome to Color Me Conscious. We have more in common than difference. Our intention is to explore the intersectionality that unites us and build consciousness about the layers of oppression we all carry.
Color Me Conscious, where consciousness is at the forefront of the discussion about race. Hello! Welcome to another edition of Color Me Conscious. I'm Myra.
And I'm Mylika, and this is Rachel Fields.
Back again.
Yeah!
Back again. And Rachel, we're just going to dive right into it. Our audience, if you guys know, we're talking about white fragility and managing whiteness. So starting off the second episode here, I'd just love to know, like, how did you decide to start studying whiteness? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, so what I had said in our last episode about being I'm a white medical student. I see these ways that my education at UCSF in Berkeley sort of reinforce racist ways that I think already. And then for my master's research, I began to look at how the way that I thought about racism was focused on people of color. So, you know, I had the thinking that if I want to do something about racism, I need to do research that shows how harmful racism is for people of color.
I think that that is a really common assumption for white people that are like socially conscious and want to do something, that there's a tendency to go outside of whiteness and into pockets and other groups and communities to try to like leverage whiteness in a way that's helpful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there could be a bit of futility in approaching things that way. So I'm so curious. I'd love to hear more about how you came to then decide to study whiteness.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that, and the harder to digest piece, is that it's very paternalizing. Like, oh, I need to come and help people of color and be an advocate for them because I'm this white woman, I'm now in academia, I have access to publishing, and I have this sort of voice of data. And so I can't help. Instead of the feedback that I got from friends and colleagues and mentors of color who were like, actually, we need you to look at white people. Like, we don't need you to we don't need you to research people of color anymore. We already know all that.
Right.
We know that racism is hurtful and harmful for people of color. It's been spelled out for 200 years.
Right.
And if you actually saw that, you wouldn't feel the need to do this.
Right.
And actually what we need you to do is do a community participatory action research with white middle class women. And
I love it. I love
people who think they're not racist but actually are really contributing to racism and not changing it.
But we've had that conversation in the past about white people being the only ones that can stop white supremacy, and white people the only ones that can stop racist systems
And my theory
because they were
that
created by white people.
Exactly. And my personal theory that racism is making white people sick.
It is.
Because making everybody sick.
Making us sick.
It's making everybody sick across the board, but white people are not excluded from that.
Well, and I think that there's this, you know, because a lot of the way that white, like, privilege works is because it's, you know, under the radar and it's not addressed directly, you know, then there's all these assumptions about how white privilege is good for us, right? Because that's, like, one of the things of why we don't want to talk about whiteness is because there's a part of us that doesn't want to lose that privilege, you know? Like, I want for everybody to have, but I don't want for my things to get taken away.
Right. Somehow giving others more means you have less.
It's seen as a them or us. It's not a yes and.
Right.
Right.
Which definitely is a pillar of white supremacy that we've talked about in the past. That either or mentality instead of yes and, instead of all of us can.
Exactly. But how that then goes about reinforcing, you know, if we're thinking about in the background, we're thinking that, oh, you know, by addressing white supremacy, then we're going to lose something. That's an assumption that white supremacy is working for us,
Right.
right?
If you
That
easily
it's
get to that.
actually like that it is working for us, and so we, even though it's bad and in some ways we want it to change, like we don't want it to change the things that are good for us. But I think if there was more dialogue about how white supremacy is really hurting us, mental health amongst the white community is a public health, like
It's an issue for everybody.
It's an epidemic, though. I mean, when it
Yeah.
comes to these, shootings and these kind of mass, like, enraged white men, like, I think part of that comes from white supremacist thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
know?
And so when we bring it back to the work that you're doing and the research that you're doing, can we talk a little bit more about some of those interviews that you had with those middle-class white women?
Yes.
What do the white ladies have to say about it when you put the microphone in their face?
Yeah, well, I interviewed 22 faculty at UCSF, and 13 of those faculty were women, and 17 were white. So they were mostly white women. And I originally had asked, I originally was focused on asking faculty how they understand what racism is and race, and how they incorporate it into their curriculum. But what they really wanted to talk about were the conversations they felt expected to have about racism.
While they're teaching someone else.
While they're teaching, so in a classroom in front of students, or in a small group, or, like we said, in the clinical, the exam room with patients, or between colleagues, or, when the deans call a town hall to address something that came up and faculty are like, I don't know how to handle this conversation. I don't have tools to deal with the intense emotions that are coming up, because you're right, it is, there's a deeper layer of sort of a sickness, and part of it is an emotional thing of like, I don't know how to deal with this intense emotion that comes up. We're talking about things that are hurtful and painful, and I don't know how to handle my own feelings about that.
Right, and they're so intrinsic in everything that we do.
Yeah.
From the moment you wake up to the moment you go sleep at night, it's everywhere. It's in the media, it's in our interpersonal relationships, it's in our power dynamics and the structures of how we move through the world, and how heavy for those that are in a position of influence and educators, right? There's a power differential between you and those that are asking questions, between you, the teacher, and the patient, or the teacher and the student. And when we add this incredibly uncomfortable layer into the conversation, it can go left real quick.
Yeah.
And someone's feelings can end up getting hurt if we're not all equipped to have the conversation before we have the conversation.
Yeah, and then you add white fragility to that with this layer of, I don't want to look racist. I'm tolerant. I want to support my students of color. I want to advocate for my colleagues of color. But I don't know how to respond to the fact that you just called me out for my lecture. Or I don't know how to respond when I don't stand up for my students.
Right. So then it can automatically get to a place of defensiveness or aversion or deflection, or just standing behind that, well, I know what's right, I'm the teacher, and don't question my authority and don't question me.
And what about one of the other pillars of white supremacist culture, the entitlement to comfort,
Right?
Right?
Because don't push me.
Exactly.
Conversation.
Right.
And I found a lot of the white faculty were really hesitant to participate. They talked about, well, I don't have experience in racism. I don't know what it's like. So
If you live in America, you have enough experience to talk about racism. Like,
Unless you're unconscious, right? Unless you're not aware of how it's playing out around you, right? Unless you're so cloaked in privilege and you're so cloaked in your homogenous world that you've never been held a mirror up to your face and never been asked to look at your own self and your own interactions.
Yeah, but that's still a part of white fragility.
Right.
Like, we don't see it,
right?
And that's part of how white fragility, how this sort of racial naivete, like Robin DiAngelo, the sociologist who coined the term white fragility, she calls it racial innocence. That I'm racially innocent, therefore I don't have to become vulnerable in these conversations, so I'm just going to step back. And a lot of faculty that I interviewed are like, I'm scared to participate, so I'm going to stay quiet over here.
wow.
But we know that that's where the complicit nature of enforcing, like I said before in our last episode, you don't have to be actively racist to complicitly reinforce racist beliefs and structures. So some of that, when you step back and you're fragile and you're afraid and you don't lean into the conversation and into the learning and into the work that it takes to be able to wake up and be conscious, when you step back and you're quiet out of fear of offending anybody or making yourself look bad or or saying the wrong thing, you're complicit to racism. You're complicit to any ism that is going on. You're complicit to sexism, and you're complicit to homophobia, and you're complicit to xenophobia, and you're complicit to every ism that's happening. If you don't say something, if you don't understand the importance of doing the work that it takes to know what to say,
That part.
right? Then you're complicit. And if you're complicit, then you're just as bad as the active racist, the active sexist, the active terrorist. You're just as complicit. You might as well pick up the gun then, because your silence is an action. Your inaction is an action.
And if this is making you uncomfortable, then we're doing our job.
Yeah, exactly. And so one question that I have, a burning one, is...
But before we get, I was just wondering what the findings were.
Yeah, well, one thing related to that is that in medicine also there's this expectation that you have to be an expert. You know, there's this added layer of, I am really well versed in the way the body works, or like this particular disease process.
So we all have to stick to things that we're good at.
Yeah, and if I'm not an expert, therefore I can't be part of this conversation and have meaningful contributions.
Oh yeah, doctors are not allowed to not know the answer.
We're not allowed to be learners.
Well, how can white people be a part of the conversation about racism and diversity if we're not part of diversity? Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue in medical education in general, is that once you get to a certain point, you're supposed to know. Or you're already supposed to know that, so don't embarrass yourself by asking that question again. You're supposed to learn that in your first year. What are you doing? You're a senior student, you're a senior resident.
Yeah.
You couldn't possibly have, no one taught you that, and there is this assumption that because I'm not allowed to not know something, then I have to know everything.
Right.
But no one knows everything.
Yeah.
Even the most tenured physician who's been doing this job for 50 years does not know everything. He might think he does. She might think she does, but she does not know everything.
Most likely they actually know a lot about very one small, narrow, specific thing.
Right, and you could be a subject matter expert, but we know that like in all of those different interactions with the diversity of patients that doctors have to see, there has to be a humility of like, I know that I don't know everything. I know that there are issues that I've never seen before. And there are nuances and anomalies, and there are exceptions to every rule. That is something that you can say that you know. I know that I don't know everything.
So tell me more about our people, these white women. What more did you find?
Yeah, so this thing about not being prepared to have these conversations. I'm not an expert, so what am I going to contribute? Which is a very clear evasion of responsibility. Because we are experts. We're experts in white privilege. Every day I benefit from it, so I'm an expert in that. This fear of offending others, like being scared to, say the wrong thing, because I'm scared of my biases. I might say something that's hurtful to a learner, and I don't therefore want to even attempt to participate. And then the one that I found so interesting, and I ended up asking participants directly, what is your role as a white educator in talking about or addressing racism at UCSF? Like, what is the role of the white person? We know what the role of people of color is because that's what we fixated on. And similar to my own story, what do you think the role is? And I found that educators can think very similar to how I thought. So, my role is supportive, it's auxiliary. I am there to support my students of color. I'm there to make sure that things that are important to my colleagues of color who are not in leadership positions and have decision-making power like I have actually get passed. I'm there essentially to sort of facilitate or advocate, rather than I'm there to make sure that I have colleagues of color who are in leadership positions with me, or that my students end up becoming my students of color do become faculty at a medical school. And then the last one was that a lot of white people don't know what they should do, and they want people of color to tell them.
Oh my God, that is so accurate. It's
Yeah.
so accurate. I mean, it's a conversation that we've had a few times, and just for listeners' sake, like, I think, what was it recently, it was like, where you're basically, let's say you're in a room, it's like 30 people, 29 are white, there's one black person, one of the 29 white people says something racist, and then everybody else in the room will like,
Turn their head.
like,
Yeah.
is the black person okay with that? Like,
It's
is that
all
okay?
eyes on you.
As if, yeah, and it's like,
Yeah.
like that person of color's like responsibility to be the like litmus test, right?
Right.
Of like what is and isn't tolerated.
Yeah.
And the reality is, like, as a white person, I can be offended by somebody saying the N-word. It doesn't, I don't have to wait for a black person to say that's offensive for me to feel offended by it,
Right.
based on my beliefs and the way that the world is. Like,
Yeah.
it's not okay,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
And you're right, there's not, like, I feel like more white people need to have, like, a not on my watch sort
Right.
Yeah.
of,
Right.
Well, and
you know?
it's about reframing. Like, we need to talk about racism. We need to talk about racism that we're like focus racism as actually we're talking about white supremacy.
Right.
That racism is part of white supremacy.
Right.
It's
Right.
the little car you drive. It's the car white supremacy drives. It's not.
Yeah.
White supremacy is the driver. Racism
Right.
is not the driver. It's the car that white supremacy is driving.
Right.
And so we need to reframe the conversation to not focus on racism, which white people continue to think is, well, then we're focusing on people of color and how racism hurts people of color. Therefore, addressing racism has to be in the hands of people of color. They're the ones responsible for doing the hard work, for being the leadership in this. And if we reframe the conversation to look at white supremacy, to look at whiteness, white privilege, then we reframe who is responsible for doing the work.
Right. And that's such a great point. And one of the questions I had is, what can white people do to recognize, acknowledge, and combat white fragility and white supremacy?
Yeah. So as a good medical student, I made my own little algorithm.
Yes. It's like the diarrhea decision tree with racism.
Yeah. So step one, you know the signs.
Anybody who works at UCSF knows about the diarrhea decision tree. It's like this algorithm that nurses have for assessing bowel movements and what it means.
It's very important.
It is.
Bodily functions.
So important, ins and outs. So the first step for white people, I think, is very simple. You acknowledge that white supremacy is real.
Ooh.
And that's not easy.
No.
You acknowledge that what people of color have been saying around you for hundreds of years is true.
Yeah.
And that's hard because we've been trained to be colorblind, to not see it, to not be aware that the air we're all breathing is white supremacy.
Right.
It's infused with white supremacy. That's step one. White supremacy is real.
Right.
Two is you learn to see it. Okay, how are my interactions playing out white supremacy? How are my interactions with patients? How are my interactions with learners or with teachers? How is it playing out on the political field nationally? How is it playing out at the grocery store? Et cetera, et cetera. You start to see it. You start to see this invisible air or water around us.
Right.
And then the third part is you start to feel it. And this is twofold. The first part of feeling it is you start to feel your own feelings. So you get a sense of what are my feelings. And I say this because I think culturally we don't invest in knowing your feelings.
That is very true.
And if I'm going to respond to someone saying, hey, Rachel, that was really hurtful what you said, and it was racist, and I'm going to respond, I'm going to feel a ton of shame, I'm going to feel guilt, I'm going to feel embarrassed, I'm going to shut down, or I'm going to become somewhat aggressive, or it's like, that's feelings leaking out of me.
Yeah.
And if I can't identify what I'm feeling, then I can't say, oh, look, I'm shutting down, but really what I want to do in this moment is acknowledge what I said. But I can't because my feelings get in the way.
Right.
And then the deeper part of this is feeling how terrible the effects of racism are and that I contribute to this. And this is what I think you're saying about how white people are, in a sense, also suffering from this sickness of racism, is that we're taught not to feel it. It's shitty.
Yeah.
You know, and people change things that they feel, that they can feel. And white fragility is the shield from having an authentic emotional reaction to how terrible racism is.
Yeah.
You are so on point there. Like, can I just?
Yeah.
Because I know I need a second, because we were actually having a related conversation before, and Mylika was kind of going through this anecdote. She was talking about this experience she had where she was being aggressed. This man was being racist towards her.
Oh yeah, in front of the hospital.
Right.
Yeah,
and then she kind of just broke down how in like basically 6.5 seconds she was able to do an assessment of this man, of what his capabilities were, where he was coming from, acknowledging the fact that she was at her job, compartmentalizing her emotions about it, responding in a way that was appropriate based on all those different factors.
Yeah.
Right? And I was talking to her, just acknowledging and appreciating the degree of emotional intelligence and self-awareness that she displayed in that moment. And I think that in general, people of color and people who've been othered have to like reinforce that emotional intelligence and that self-awareness, because there's a constant policing of white supremacist culture that is like, you can only, react within these, certain channels. And like when you do this as somebody who's othered, there's going to be a response. And that response is not going to be favorable. So then you got to navigate those sort of channels. And I think part of white privilege and that white supremacist underlying like benefit is that like as whites, you're saying we don't have to manage the emotions related to white supremacy. And I think you're so on point talking about the fact that we don't have to feel it, because we're talking about how is it that that white privilege and how it's so like under the radar, it's like it's invisible. Well, of course, if it's invisible, then if we're not seeing it, we're not feeling it, and that is really, really powerful.
And that's really where the transition. That's the transition point. You go from racial innocence. Right?
That's interesting, by the way.
Right, and transition into complete awareness. Right. So that starts with self-awareness, and then you can project that out. But like any hurt that's put, if I'm hurt by something you did or something you said, you don't then get to tell me, but it's not that bad. But I didn't mean to hurt you.
Or don't tell me in that way.
Don't tell me that you're hurt. That hurts me. Like the hurt, you know what I mean? When really someone who is hurt, and if they're strong enough to express it, because a lot of people get hurt in a lot of different ways and don't express it at all, right? So if you're lucky enough to have someone tell you, hey, that was hurtful. That I don't like the way you said that, or the way you said that hurt me, or what you did hurt me. Then you, as the person who's now the hurter, you're not allowed to tell the hurt person that it wasn't that bad, or to imply any judgment to that. In fact, you take that as an opportunity for growth. You take that as an opportunity for self-assessment. You're like, wait a minute, what did I say that was hurtful? What did I do that was hurtful? Help me understand your perspective on the situation. There is that humility that has to come, and taking responsibility for your actions, right? And it's breaking that fourth wall of white privilege and white supremacy that gives you permission as a white person to never acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what we're trying to change. That's what part of being conscious is about. Is that, like, wait a minute, I'm conscious, I'm aware, I understand that everything I say and everything I do, every action creates a reaction, right? And that's physics, that's basic. So then as you're physically moving through the world, understand that everything you do, everything you say, there is a reaction that's going to happen. That it's just inevitable, right? And so we want to be mindful of what that is. What impact are you having on the people around you everywhere, right?
And I'm curious, like, what has that been like for you to apply those principles in your own life, in your everyday actions?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
I would imagine.
Because it opens me up to really having to listen and hear people say, that wasn't cool. Or to say, like, that really hurt me. And then I feel all those feelings of shame and guilt. And but it also, it's more meaningful. You know, I then have these experiences with people where I'm now at a point, and this is a daily process for me. I feel like every day I'm still learning how to do this. I feel incredibly awkward in my white fragility, and that's okay. I feel incredibly awkward as a medical student and as someone who's an adult, and like this is one of the things that is something I actively need to pursue learning how to do. And it's uncomfortable. And I think part of this too, and one of the takeaways from my research is, how do we help medical educators, how do we help teachers, how do we help white people see that it's okay, you're gonna be uncomfortable, and how do we say, okay, here's the dish of uncomfortable, please eat it.
Right.
You're gonna love it one day.
Right.
Because it's the more authentic way to be.
I think the most powerful evidence for the fact that you should eat the plate of uncomfortable is that after you do, you're still alive. Like, she's still alive.
Yeah.
She ate the uncomfortable pie and she's still here. Like, so believe that you too will live through the pain of discomfort. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
You live through it. You're not gonna die.
You know, for me, I'm just trying to do this little juxtaposition because I think about how offline, before you were telling me about the work that you did previously where you were working more focused with communities of color.
Yeah.
And like, I just think about like the space as like a white do-gooder, you know, in those spaces. Then a lot of times, you know, you kind of could be in a place where it's like you're getting praise for the work that you do because like, oh, you're so like, you know, you have such a big heart, you know, look at you going outside of your community and trying to make an impact and blah, 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 you know. So it's interesting to kind of do this shift where it's like, you know, you could receive a lot of external praise as a white person for supporting groups and causes for people of color.
Right.
Yet when you turn that focus and you start looking at, well, what about my community and what about whiteness? And then all of the stuff that comes up and that you know, have to be uncomfortable, but also may not receive praise and appreciation from whites about the work that you're doing.
Right, and in fact, you may get attacked for doing it because their white fragility is activated. And like, wait a minute, you're gonna go out there.
You're making me really uncomfortable.
You're gonna
It's like making me really uncomfortable.
Right, and it's like, wait a minute, you're gonna go out there and shake up the white tree, and like all this white truth is gonna
All the
fall
white
out.
fruits are falling
All the
down.
white fruit's gonna fall from our white tree. What do you think you're doing?
And people eat the apple and then they wake up. It's like Adam
my
and Eve.
God.
Like,
And that's a cause for the alarm right there. So when we talk about all the work that needs to be done, I mean, what are some resources, right? Let's get tangible. What are some of the resources? Books, videos, authors, any social media? Lay it on them. Let them know where they can go. How can we start to change some of this?
Yeah, well, one thing for UCSF faculty, I'm working on an anti-racism toolkit with my mentor for this research, Dr. Andrea Jackson, who is a professor at UCSF and part of the Differences Matter. She's a lead on one of the Differences Matter committees. And we're creating a toolkit that spells out some of these concepts for faculty. And in terms of sort of do your homework, I think a really good starting place to really understand like whiteness and it's all around me is this podcast called Scene on Radio. And it's seen like theater scene, SCENE.
Oh, okay.
And the series is called Seeing White.
I actually have I have that on my like queue of ones to listen to.
It's so good, and it's just so explicit and direct. And it takes, there's like 30 episodes, and it just takes you through historical sort of formations of the concept of whiteness and like how it works now.
So we know if you listen to this podcast, you like podcasts. So
Listen to this podcast.
Listen to this podcast. Then listen to that podcast.
Definitely plug in Scene on
Radio.
Radio.
Yeah, and the Seeing White series.
Scene
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and then we can always, pull out our Googles and do a great search online. I'm sure that there are, there's other books. I've heard of a book called White Fragility specifically.
Yeah, that's a great book to start with.
Yeah, that folks can read. Anybody can read. You don't have to be white to read it. Everybody can read it.
True. And there's also like White Like Me, Tim Wise.
Yeah.
Good author.
Yeah. I think the White Fragility, it's called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, is such a great starting place. Yeah. Because she just spells it out also. Like, this is what white fragility is, and here's how it happens. Yeah. So a lot of what we talked about, it is in that book. So that's a good starting place. I also think, like there's the movies this year. You could watch Blind Spotting.
Yeah,
I love that movie.
We did a whole episode about it. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
That's a great way. Yeah.
Listen to interviews with scholars, with thinkers. Yes. Poetry, just start to explore the world of one, if you feel like you don't understand how racism works, just start to read up about it.
Right.
And then also have conversations. Yeah. Try talking about it.
Right.
It's okay to make mistakes.
We are at one medical institution, but we know that our medical institution does reflect the situations that are at a lot of medical institutions, education institutions, and just any kind of bureaucratic institution anywhere.
We're actually the #1 hospital in California.
So the thing that I would like to just implore our audience to do is check the institutions where you work, the schools that you go to, your churches, your local community. Actually, the city that you live in may have a race and equity committee. It may have a department that's focused on having these conversations and educating people and directing you towards tools that exist. So wherever you are in the world, wherever you are in the country, I guarantee you that there is a NAACP chapter, or there's a coalition, or there is a race and equity council somewhere in the institutions that you already move through, that you're already a part of, that could kind of tap you in and dial you into more resources and actually get you active. If you've done your assessments and you've done your reading and you feel like you're ready to start doing something and start impacting the lives of other people, there is somewhere around you immediately that you'd be able to start. I say start with your school, start with your job, and if there isn't one, then maybe you're the one to start one after you've done some of that work that needs to be done.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And in terms of resources, also, if you check out our website, we'll go ahead and post a link for some of the research that Rachel has done, as well as her email address.
And some additional resources.
You can be in contact with this lovely woman right here and learn all about whiteness and white fragility direct from the source. And let's invite more white women to have these conversations.
And white men, because as we know, a lot of these institutions that are perpetuating white supremacy are led by white men. And what we've seen is that they're the last ones to come into the conversation. If you talk about who's white and who's coming to the conversation, first it's white women. We need to explicitly invite white men to the conversation. I need every woke white man that's out there to go grab 2 other white men and bring them into the conversation, and let's all accept responsibility for fixing the situation that none of us made, but all of us live in. Some of us benefit from, some of us don't. But let's just all get active about that, okay? And this has been a very fun episode. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Yes.
I'm Mylika.
I'm Myra.
And this is Color Be Conscious. Bye.
Thank you for listening. And if we made you think and you'd like to continue the conversation, visit our website, www.colormeconsciouspodcast.com, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Color Me Conscious Podcast.